The morning he left, the rain came early, not a gentle drizzle, but the kind that feels like the sky is mourning something it can't explain. Thomas Hale sat at the small wooden table by the kitchen window, the same table he had built with his own hands when Peter was born. The steam from his coffee curled and vanished in the gray light. He hadn't taken a sip in 10 minutes. His hands rested on either side of the cup, fingers tapping a slow rhythm, the same rhythm his heart had been beating since he got the letter. Across the room, Evelyn stood with her back to him, tying a ribbon around his duffel bag. Her movements were precise, mechanical, as if the right knot could keep him from leaving. Every so often, she would stop, breathe, and start again. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to drown out the rain. Their son Peter sat on the floor with his crayons scattered around him, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. He was drawing a man in a helmet holding a flag, stick limbs, crooked smile, red and blue lines bleeding into each other. Lucy, only 3, was sitting in Evelyn's lap with her rag doll pressed to her cheek, watching her father with wide, solemn eyes. She didn't understand the word war, but she understood the way her mother's hands shook. The radio hummed softly from the counter, some distant voice talking about new offensives in Europe, about men whose names no one would ever remember. "You don't have to go," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet like glass. She didn't turn around. "They've got enough men already. You're 34, Tom. They can't possibly need." "They do." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "And they asked." She turned then, eyes wet, anger blooming beneath the grief. "You think they asked? They told you. They told all of you. You think they'll remember you, Thomas Hale, when this is all over? You'll just be another." He stood, chair scraping the floor. "Don't." For a moment, neither spoke. The rain filled the silence between them, a steady drum against the windowpane. Evelyn's lips trembled. "And what about us? What about your children? You think they'll understand why their father chose a gun over them?" He closed the distance between them slowly, stopping just short of touching her. He could smell the lavender soap on her skin, could see the pulse at her neck fluttering like a trapped bird. "If I don't go," he said quietly, "what do I tell them when they're older? That I stayed home while others fought for them? That I watched the world burn and did nothing?" Her eyes searched his face for something, conviction, maybe. Or guilt. "You'll come back," she whispered. He hesitated. "I'll try." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the only truth he had left to give. By the time they reached the train station, the sky had turned from gray to steel. The platform was chaos, a sea of uniforms, mothers clutching sons, wives gripping photographs, children clinging to knees. The smell of coal and sweat hung thick in the air. A whistle blew somewhere down the line. The train loomed like a beast of smoke and iron, ready to devour another generation of men. Evelyn stood beside him, small beneath the weight of the moment. Peter held her hand, half hiding behind her coat, while Lucy fussed in her arms. "Promise me," she said. Her voice was fragile, but steady. "Promise you'll write. Every week." "Every week," he said, forcing a smile. "No matter where I am." Peter tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, will you be a hero?" Thomas crouched down, meeting his son's eager eyes. "A hero?" He chuckled softly. "I'll try my best. But heroes are just men who keep going when they're scared. So, you be a hero too, all right? Help your mom. Take care of your sister." Peter nodded solemnly, as though he'd just been given a mission of his own. Lucy reached out, her small hand grabbing at his coat. "Daddy home soon?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas felt something in his chest crack. He kissed her forehead, then Peter's, and finally Evelyn's. "I'll find my way back," he said. But the look in her eyes told him she didn't believe it, and deep down, neither did he. The loudspeaker crackled, calling his name. Thomas took a step back. Evelyn reached for him as if she could stop time itself, but he was already moving. The train hissed as it began to move, iron wheels clattering like distant thunder. He found a spot by the window and pressed his hand to the glass. Evelyn's figure blurred in the steam, Peter's small hand waving wildly beside her, Lucy crying against her shoulder. He kept his hand raised long after they were gone from sight. The train rolled on for hours, slicing through the countryside like a blade. Thomas stared out at the passing fields, once green, now brown and lifeless. Every station they stopped at was filled with the same sight, wives weeping, soldiers laughing too loud, pretending they weren't afraid. He opened his duffel bag and found Evelyn had packed a small tin of her apple preserves, wrapped in a cloth with a note tucked inside. For when it feels too far from home. He traced her handwriting with his thumb until the ink smudged. He didn't open the tin. Not yet. The man across from him, a farmhand from Kentucky, was reading a worn Bible. "You married?" he asked. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "2 kids." The farmhand nodded. "Then you know what's hardest about war." Thomas glanced up. "It's not killing," the man said, closing the Bible. "It's remembering what it felt like before you had to." Thomas didn't answer. He turned back to the window. Outside, dusk fell like a curtain. He could see his reflection, the face of a man who no longer looked like himself. That night, in the dim light of the train's cabin, Thomas took out a small notebook and began to write his first letter home. "My dearest Evelyn. By the time you read this, I'll be somewhere on the Atlantic. It still doesn't feel real. I keep thinking I'll wake up and it'll be Sunday morning again, you making coffee, Peter chasing Lucy through the house, the radio humming in the kitchen. I miss the sound of it. The quiet. The smell of home. Tell Peter to be brave. Tell Lucy to remember my face. And tell yourself, Evie, that I'm coming back. Because I am. I have to. Love always. Tom." He folded the paper carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. He didn't know when he'd be able to send it, but writing it made him feel human again, like part of him was still there with them, across the ocean. They stopped at a military outpost the next morning. The men were separated, processed, given uniforms that didn't fit, rifles that smelled of grease, and instructions barked by strangers who acted like they owned their souls. That night, Thomas lay in a bunk surrounded by the sound of 50 men trying not to think about what came next. Someone was crying quietly in the dark. Another whispered a prayer. Thomas stared at the ceiling. He imagined Evelyn asleep with Lucy in her arms, Peter curled up on the couch waiting for the morning. He could almost smell her hair, hear the creak of the floorboards in their little house. The thought of it made his chest ache so badly he had to bite down on his sleeve to keep from crying out. War hadn't even begun, and already it had taken something from him, something he couldn't name. He closed his eyes and whispered into the dark, "I'll come home. I'll come home." But even as he said it, the words felt like a prayer cast into a void too deep to answer. The first thing Thomas Hale learned about war was that it never really stopped. Even when the guns fell silent, it lingered, in the smell of burning oil, in the mud clinging to his boots, in the screams that echoed long after they were gone. By the winter of 1940, he had crossed the ocean and been baptized by fire. France had fallen. The Allies were scattered like ash across Europe, and Thomas found himself in a world of mud, metal, and men who no longer remembered what warmth felt like. His unit, the 16th Infantry, was dug into a trench near St. Lo, where every sunrise looked like the end of the world. The air always stank of rot and fear. Men coughed through the nights, rats chewed on boots and bandages, and the dead lay buried just deep enough to keep the living company. The line between sanity and survival was a thread stretched thin enough to cut. Thomas had changed already. His letters to Evelyn became shorter, more hesitant. The first few were filled with small reassurances: I'm eating well. The men are good. I miss the kids. By the 10th, they were nothing but fragments: I'm still here. It's cold. I love you. He stopped writing after Jenkins died. There were 4 of them left from the original group. Corporal Jenkins, or was Jenkins, had been the heart of the squad, a man with a crooked grin and a laugh that could find light even in hell. He used to joke that when the war ended, he'd open a bar called The Last Trench and everyone who made it out alive would drink for free. Then, one morning, he was gone. A single shell had erased him so completely that the men only found his helmet. Thomas carried that helmet for weeks, unable to let it go, as if a part of Jenkins still clung to the rusted steel. Then there was Miller, a boy really, 19, from Kansas, with the voice of someone who had never yelled before. He carried a photograph of his mother folded into his breast pocket, took it out every night, kissed it once, and whispered something only she could hear. And Captain Reese, square-jawed, hard as granite, the kind of man who didn't need to shout to be heard. His calm terrified Thomas more than the bombs. They were ghosts wrapped in khaki, walking the fine line between life and legend. It happened in November, under a sky so dark it felt hollow. The Germans shelled them before dawn, a storm of fire that tore through the trenches, shaking the ground until it felt like the earth itself was trying to flee. Thomas woke to the sound of his own name, but when he turned, Jenkins was gone, nothing but a crater where he'd been sleeping. "Move!" Reese shouted, dragging Miller by the collar as explosions painted the world in orange and black. Thomas grabbed his rifle, though he couldn't remember why. The ground erupted beside him, soil and bone and metal rained down. For a moment, he thought he was blind, then realized the smoke had simply turned everything into shadow. He fired without seeing, without thinking. The sound of bullets was nothing compared to the screaming. When it ended, dawn came slowly, pale and wrong. The battlefield was a graveyard. Half their unit was gone. Jenkins's laugh, that stupid, wonderful laugh, had been swallowed by silence. Thomas sat in the mud for hours, staring at his hands. They wouldn't stop shaking. His rifle was empty, but he couldn't unclench his fingers from it. He had survived, again. And he hated himself for it. A week later, the mail came, the first in 2 months. 2 letters bore his name. The first was from Evelyn. "My dearest Tom. Peter lost his first tooth yesterday. He wanted to send it to you so the fairy could find you too. Lucy talks to your picture every night. I tell her you're fighting the bad men, but she says they should just say sorry and stop. Maybe she's right. I dream of you every night, please come back to us soon. I'm still keeping your side of the bed warm. Yours always, Evie." The second was from his mother, shaky and short. "The news says it's bad over there. Take care of yourself, son. Don't lose your soul." Thomas folded both letters and put them against his heart. That night, he sat under a broken tree and lit a cigarette with hands that barely remembered how to be steady. The smoke curled upward and disappeared into the fog. He wanted to cry but couldn't. It was as though the war had dried up every part of him that was capable of feeling. Winter came like punishment. The snow erased the dead but not their smell. Everything was white, the ground, the air, their faces, but beneath it all was rot. They marched for days through blizzards, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes hollow from hunger. The wind cut through their coats like knives. Miller started to cough, then bleed, then one morning simply sat down in the snow and refused to move. "Just a minute," he said softly. "Just 1 minute." Captain Reese tried to drag him, but Miller shook his head. "Tell my mother I tried," he whispered. Thomas stood beside him until the snow covered his hair. Then he walked on. No one said a word. By dusk, Miller was a white mound in the endless cold. When spring finally came, it didn't bring warmth, only a different kind of death. They pushed through ruined villages, the skeletons of houses standing like broken teeth. Children stared from shattered doorways, silent and pale. Women carried buckets of water with hands too thin for the task. Thomas tried to offer a chocolate bar to one little boy, but the child just looked at him, eyes wide, expression empty, and ran away. He hadn't realized until then how much they looked like monsters. One evening, they camped near a bombed-out church. Reese ordered them to rest. Thomas wandered inside, stepping over shattered glass and charred pews. At the altar lay a single, unburnt Bible. He picked it up, brushed off the ash, and opened to a random page. "And he who has no sword, let him sell his cloak and buy one." Thomas laughed bitterly. The sound echoed through the ruins. He tore the page out and used it to light his cigarette. A few nights later, a messenger brought them new orders: move east at dawn. The front was shifting again. The war never stayed still long enough for anyone to rest. Thomas lay awake that night, staring at the stars through a hole in his tent. Somewhere out there, Evelyn was probably tucking Peter and Lucy into bed. He imagined her brushing Peter's hair back, whispering stories, pretending not to cry when the lights went out. He reached into his coat and pulled out her last letter, worn thin from being read too many times. He began to write on the back of it. "Evie. I don't know who I am anymore. The things I've seen, I can't wash them off. Sometimes I dream of home, but it feels like another life. If I don't come back, tell Peter I'm proud of him. Tell Lucy I love her laugh. And you, don't wait too long. Promise me you'll live. Tom." He didn't send it. He folded it, tucked it away. A secret confession to no one but the night. At dawn, they moved. Shells rained again, relentless and merciless. The air turned to thunder, the earth splitting beneath their feet. Reese was shouting orders, but Thomas couldn't hear him, just the deafening rhythm of war itself. He ran through smoke and mud, rifle clutched tight, body running on something beyond thought. He fired until his shoulder burned. When the smoke cleared, half their line was gone. Reese lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes found Thomas's, calm even in death. Thomas knelt beside him. "We're done, Captain. We're done." But Reese didn't answer. He stayed there until the others dragged him away. That night, after they regrouped, the sky was strangely clear. Stars blinked faintly above the ruins, distant and uncaring. Thomas sat alone, helmet in his hands. He thought of Jenkins's laughter, Miller's soft prayers, Reese's silence, all gone, swallowed by a war too vast to understand. He had come to fight for his family, for his country, for something called honor. But now, sitting there beneath a sky full of indifferent stars, he realized he couldn't remember what any of it meant. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Evelyn's ribbon, the one she had tied around his duffel bag the morning he left. It was frayed now, darkened by soot. He tied it around his wrist and whispered, "I'll find my way back." The wind carried the words away. And for the first time since he'd left home, Thomas didn't know if he believed them anymore. When the war finally ended, it didn't feel like victory. There were no cheers in Thomas Hale's chest, no music in his veins, only a hollow quiet that rang louder than any explosion he'd ever heard. The guns had stopped, yes, but the silence was worse. It was too clean, too wide. The kind of silence that reminded you of how many voices were missing. He stood among the wreckage of what used to be Normandy, a place now stitched together by graves and smoke. The air still tasted like gunpowder and rust. All around him, soldiers walked like ghosts who hadn't yet realized they were dead. Some laughed. Some cried. Some just stared at their hands like they didn't know what to do with them anymore. Thomas didn't celebrate. He just watched the sun rise over the ruins, pale and weak, and wondered what kind of world was waiting for him across the sea. He had survived the war, but surviving, he was learning, wasn't the same as living. In his pack, still wrapped in oil-stained cloth, was the letter he had written to Evelyn months ago, the one he couldn't bring himself to send. The edges were worn soft, the ink faded from sweat and rain. Evie. I don't know who I am anymore. The things I've seen, I can't wash them off. He stopped reading. He'd memorized every word anyway. He folded it back carefully, as though it were something sacred, and placed it against his heart. When the order finally came to go home, it didn't feel real. Men cheered, hugged, fell to their knees in gratitude. Thomas just stood there, staring at the horizon, waiting for the ground to open up again, for some shell, some sound, something to remind him that he didn't deserve to leave. But nothing came. He boarded the transport ship in silence. The Atlantic stretched endless and gray. The ship creaked and groaned beneath their boots as the wind whipped against the hull. Men smoked on the deck, laughed too loudly, drank too much, as though the ocean could wash away what they'd done. Thomas didn't join them. He stood at the rail most nights, staring at the waves, feeling them roll like the slow rhythm of memory. Every crash of the sea reminded him of something he couldn't unsee, Miller's body disappearing into snow, Reese's final breath, Jenkins's laughter cut short. He wondered what he'd say when he saw Evelyn again. How do you tell someone that you've left part of yourself in another country, buried in mud beside men who became your brothers? One night, under a sky thick with stars, he took out the tin Evelyn had packed all those years ago, the apple preserves. He'd kept it unopened the whole time, too sacred to touch. He twisted the lid off, and for a moment, the smell of sweetness cut through the salt and metal. He ate it slowly, tears burning behind his eyes. It tasted like home. It tasted like everything he'd lost. It was raining when he arrived, just like the day he left. The platform was crowded with families waiting, women clutching flowers, children waving flags. The train hissed to a stop, steam wrapping the air in white fog. Thomas stepped down and froze. He recognized her immediately, even through the mist. Evelyn stood near the edge of the crowd, a hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Beside her, Peter, taller now, older, craned his neck, searching. Little Lucy, no longer little, held her mother's coat tightly, looking unsure whether to run or hide. Thomas took one step, then another. His boots felt impossibly heavy. When Evelyn finally saw his face clearly, she dropped the flowers. "Tom," she whispered. He nodded, unable to speak. Then she was in his arms, and the world collapsed around them, all the years, the fear, the silence, gone in that single trembling embrace. Her hands clutched his coat as if to make sure he was real. He buried his face in her hair and breathed her in. He could smell lavender. He hadn't realized until then how much he'd missed it. Home was smaller than he remembered. The walls seemed closer, the furniture older, the air still carrying faint traces of dust and time. Peter showed him the toy soldiers he'd kept, one of them still painted with blue crayon where he'd once tried to color his father's uniform. Lucy hid behind Evelyn's skirt at first but eventually came forward, holding her doll, the same one from years ago, its head now stitched with care. "You're taller," Thomas said, smiling through tears. "Both of you." Peter grinned shyly. "Mom said you'd come back. I didn't think you would." Thomas's smile faltered. He knelt and put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Neither did I, sometimes." When night came, Evelyn sat by the window, sewing as she always had. The rhythm of her hands was the same, but the silence between them wasn't. "You don't talk much," she said finally. He stared at the fire. "There's not much to say." "There's everything to say," she whispered. "You've been gone 4 years, Tom. You can't just come home and pretend it didn't happen." He wanted to tell her, about the snow, the screams, the smell of blood and rain, but the words lodged in his throat. She wouldn't understand. No one could. I just want to forget, he said instead. Evelyn's eyes softened. You can't. You can only live with it. That night, he woke screaming. Evelyn held him until he stopped shaking. Neither of them said a word. In the months that followed, Thomas tried to fit himself back into the shape of a husband, a father, a man. He got a job at the factory again, though the noise of the machines made his chest tighten. The hammering echoed the sound of artillery, and every time someone dropped a wrench, his body flinched before his mind could stop it. At church, people clapped his back, called him a hero. You did your duty, Tom, they said. He smiled politely, but the word hero felt like a wound. At night, he'd sit on the porch, watching the wind move through the trees. The world had kept spinning without him, but inside, he was still somewhere in the mud, holding a rifle, waiting for dawn. Peter started asking questions. Did you kill anyone, Dad? Thomas didn't answer. He just said, sometimes being brave doesn't mean fighting. Sometimes it means living after. The boy didn't understand, but maybe one day he would. It was near winter again when the dreams returned. He'd wake up gasping, hearing Jenkins laugh, Miller call his name. He'd feel the ground trembling beneath him, smell the smoke, the snow, the rot. Sometimes he'd reach for his rifle before remembering there were no rifles here. Only Evelyn, holding him, whispering, "You're home, Tom. You're home." But was he? He'd walk through the town and see faces that looked like the dead, the baker, the postman, the man who swept the streets. Every sound carried memory. The war lived inside him like an echo that refused to fade. One day, he found himself standing in front of the train station again, staring at the tracks that had once taken him away. A cold wind swept through. He closed his eyes and whispered the names of the men he'd lost. He didn't know if anyone could hear him, but it felt right to say them aloud. Jenkins. Miller. Reese. The last trench, the frozen road, the fire within. He stayed there until the whistle of a passing train jolted him back to the present. That night, while rummaging through an old box, he found something, the ribbon Evelyn had tied to his duffel bag. It was still stained with soot, frayed at the ends. He remembered tying it around his wrist that last night on the front, telling himself he'd find his way home. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding it between his fingers. Evelyn came in quietly. You kept that? She asked softly. I kept everything, he said. Even the things I wish I hadn't. She knelt beside him, placing her hand over his. Then maybe it's time to stop carrying it alone. Thomas looked at her, really looked. The years had changed her too. There were faint lines around her eyes, silver strands in her hair. But her gaze was steady, the same one that had watched him leave years ago, full of fear and love all at once. He nodded slowly. I don't know if I can. You can, she said. Just don't do it all at once. And for the first time since he'd come home, Thomas let himself cry. A few days later, Thomas walked to the post office carrying an envelope. Inside was the letter he'd written long ago, the one he'd never mailed. He handed it to the clerk. Can you send this? The clerk glanced at it. No address? Thomas smiled faintly. Doesn't matter. It's for someone who's gone. The man hesitated, then nodded. I'll see that it's taken care of. Thomas walked outside into the crisp air. The sun was breaking through clouds, soft and gold. He stood there, breathing, and felt, for the first time, that he was truly back. Spring came again, gentle and quiet. The fields bloomed. Peter and Lucy played by the fence, chasing each other in the tall grass. Evelyn hung laundry in the breeze, humming an old tune. Thomas sat on the porch, carving a small piece of wood with his pocketknife, shaping it into something simple and human. A bird. He wasn't the man who left. He wasn't the man who fought. He was something in between, scarred, quieter, but still here. Evelyn called from the yard, "Dinner's ready." He smiled. As he rose, his gaze lingered on the horizon, the same one he'd once watched through a train window as his family disappeared into fog. Now, the fog was gone. Now, there was light. He walked toward the house, toward the laughter, toward life. And though the ghosts of the war would always whisper, for the first time, Thomas Hale didn't turn away. He just kept walking, one step, then another, down the long road home.